Welcome back to the IEA's podcast, Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. This week we're looking at energy security in Ukraine ahead of the winter months. The fact that this will be Ukraine's fourth wartime winter feels like a grim milestone. Ukrainian citizens have adapted to energy shortages and blackouts, but in recent months, Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy systems have intensified. A huge drone attack on October 10th in Kyiv left over 800,000 residents without power. And according to the Ukrainian government, their power sector has been attacked and disrupted over 3,000 times since March. Over the spring and summer, Ukraine focused on repairing damaged energy infrastructure, but as attacks continue and temperatures drop, what can Ukraine do to boost energy security? And what role can the international community play to support Ukrainians through the coming months? I sat down with Talya Vatman, the IEA's Caspian and Black Sea Programme Manager, and we spoke on October 17th after she had returned from 7 days in Ukraine.
So night has just fallen and it's a bit chilly. The lights are coming on and we're here in mid-October, which is traditionally the start of heating season in Ukraine. And for the last 3 years, that's meant that Russia ramps up attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. 2 nights ago, we saw a massive attack that really hit a lot of Kyiv's energy infrastructure hard. Combined heat and power plants were damaged, and water supply to most of the city was really impacted. Took almost a full day for water to be back for most of the city. There were rolling blackouts. Russia is getting much, much better at targeting critical infrastructure. It's able to send a lot more drones. It's learned a lot about how to avoid and confuse some of Ukraine's air defenses, and the interception rates have really fallen in the last 2 months. So the IEA is here in Kyiv to talk to different power system stakeholders, to talk to government officials, to understand how Ukraine is trying to ready itself for the onslaught of attacks that it knows are coming. And it really feels like the city, really the country, is bracing itself, not just for another massive attack, but for what could be a really, really hard winter to come.
Now, before we hear the full interview with Talya, I wanted to share a bit of her conversation with Ukrainian Energy Minister Svetlana Grinchuk and her thoughts on energy security in Ukraine right now.
Now they attacked mostly energy in the frontline regions, and the main challenge is to protect the energy facilities in these regions, to reconnect the system, to provide the electricity to the people. Of course, we all understand that without energy, without electricity, it's impossible to survive.
Okay, Talya, thank you so much for joining us. Now, you've just returned from Ukraine, and I'd like to start by reflecting on just how important energy security is for people's lives. So could you tell us about the reality of energy blackouts and the impact of not being able to heat your home?
When you don't have access to electricity and you can't heat your home, the way you live completely changes. It's so much harder to work. It's so much harder to cook. I mean, you can't really afford to even open your fridge during a blackout because everything will go bad very quickly. You might also be spending a lot of time in shelters. You're not sleeping properly. And it just makes it really hard to plan your life, especially as you don't know when the next attack will come, when the lights are going to turn back on. And another thing people don't really think about is the access to water. So a lot of the attacks, even if you're hitting energy infrastructure, you might be hitting water pumping stations as well. So if you don't have access to water, especially if you live on a higher floor of an apartment building, it's even harder to carry on to do all of the basic things that you need to do in life. And in the winter, it's even more severe because it's pretty cold. And even if you then get a space heater, you need electricity. You might need a portable battery. So, it changes your life completely.
And when we're talking about blackouts, are they happening all over the country, and how frequently are they happening?
That's a really good question. I mean, it really changes the way that Russian attacks always change throughout the year, throughout seasons. So there might be rolling blackouts at times where the grid has been attacked or a certain power station has been attacked, or it might happen a few weeks after if the grid is unstable and the system operator has to start doing load shedding and essentially, have blackouts in certain areas to rebalance the grid. So you really don't know exactly what's going to happen until the attack happens.
Okay, and I think it would be useful if we could just set out what some of the risks are to energy security this year and perhaps how they compare to other years over the past 2 or 3 years.
Of course. Essentially, the risks are the same every year. We don't know what the temperature is going to be, the average temperature this winter. If you have colder than average temperatures, that's going to increase demand. That's always something that's really hard to predict. It means that you have more demand for natural gas. It means that people are using more power in their homes often. So that's one huge risk that we are always looking out for. The other risk is Russian attack patterns. If we see a lot of Russian massive attacks on energy infrastructure, if you see that the air defense isn't working as well as it has, if there's less air defense for key power plants, it's going to be a lot harder. And the big risk, especially for this year, is if Russia is able to successfully split that west to east grid connection. And so if they're able to kind of isolate the east from the west, it's going to make this winter really, really hard, especially for cities that are closer to the front lines.
Okay, now I want to talk a bit about how the threat has evolved. And by that, I mean that Russia has been attacking Ukrainian energy systems since the start of the full-scale invasion. But what are the new threats that the population might have to deal with this winter?
So one thing we've seen throughout this year that we hadn't seen before, there's been a heavy focus on attacking gas production infrastructure. We've also seen a recent increase in the number of drones deployed in each attack. And just for context, the worst attack on energy infrastructure of the war happened on September 7th, where we saw Russia send 810 drones alongside 13 missiles. And to compare that to August 26th of last year, that was the biggest attack of 2024. That only had 100 drones alongside a substantial number of missiles. Russia has really ramped up its ability to produce and deploy more drones this year. And the more drones launched, the easier it is to confuse Ukraine's air defenses and reduce the interception rate. And so the scale is something that we really had not seen in the first 3 years of the war. Russia is also starting to use lighter and smaller drones, which are harder to detect, especially if you have challenging weather conditions.
Okay, and maybe we could just put the scale of that damage into context. And perhaps one way of doing that is thinking about energy capacity before the war and how that's reduced and what the energy capacity is today.
So I do want to caveat that Ukraine right now has martial law in place, and that extends to energy data as well. And so exact data on energy has been really hard to come by. Our estimates at the IEA are based on open source research and our own tracking of damages, losses, and recovery of energy infrastructure. But before 2022, Ukraine's available dispatchable power generation capacity was about 38 gigawatts. So this number does not include variable renewables like wind and solar because those are not accessible 24/7. So that's what we mean by available dispatchable. And especially in the winter, you really don't have as much solar and a bit less wind. So we saw in the first year of this full-scale invasion, losses due to occupation, destruction, and damage amounted to 19 gigawatts. We also saw more attacks in the spring of 2024, and then we saw Ukraine's capacity fall to about 12 gigawatts. Ahead of last winter, Ukraine was able to restore 3, and it's continued to repair and add additional capacity throughout this past year, despite ongoing attacks and losses. So in September, we estimated that Ukraine had about 16.5 gigawatts of available power generation, including mobile gas turbines, but not renewables. But we believe that this number has actually declined somewhat further in the last 2 weeks due to repeated attacks, including last Friday's attack when I was there on 2 of Kyiv's thermal power plants.
Okay, so really roughly, it's a third of what it was before the full-scale invasion, but it then has repaired some of that. So Let's focus on some of those repairs. And there was obviously a huge effort to get power systems back online over the spring and summer. So how was that possible during those months? And really, maybe you could tell us how successful that restoration was and in terms of what their goals were and what the end results were.
So over the spring and summer, we saw a quote unquote energy ceasefire. So that meant that Russia was not attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure quite as much as it was before. Ukraine wasn't really attacking Russian refineries in the same way. So there were some continued attacks, but it was a lot quieter, and that allowed for energy companies to restore both power and gas infrastructure. So by September, Ukraine's gas production was fully back online after losing about 40% in the February attacks. A lot of power infrastructure was also repaired and replaced. So we estimate that Ukraine recovered at least 1.5 gigawatts by the end of the summer. However, the attacks that we saw starting in September and, of course, in the last 2 weeks of October have started to erode this recovery.
Okay, you mentioned gas that I want to dig into a little bit later, but I think it's just worth reminding people about Ukraine's energy mix right now in terms of how it's powering itself. So maybe you could just tell us about the mix of energy sources that it's using today.
Of course. So before the full-scale invasion and even now, nuclear energy plays a massive role in Ukraine's energy mix. It continues to be about 50% of Ukraine's power generation capacity. Next, you have thermal power plants that's run on coal and natural gas. That's about 30%. And then you have large-scale hydropower plants at about a quarter. So again, because electricity generated by renewables isn't always available, they can play a massive role, particularly in the summer. But in the wintertime, they contribute less to the energy mix. So at their peak, they can actually almost be a fifth of Ukraine's total generation, but it's just kind of hard to classify their impact throughout the year.
So has renewable energy actually gone up since the full-scale invasion compared to how it was before?
Renewable energy has gone up, but that's because so much other capacity has been destroyed, as well as renewables being added to the system.
Perhaps we could just talk a bit about how neighboring countries are helping. So how much energy is being imported into Ukraine and who are the key contributors of that energy?
So on the power side, Ukraine is now fully synchronized with the European power system, ENTSO-E. But due to technical constraints, the maximum import capacity reached has been about 2.1 gigawatts. Right now, there is a maximum of 1.7 gigawatts with a weekly calculation process that's quite technical that does allow for a bit more flexibility. And we have Ukraine's neighbors, including Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Moldova, all providing volumes of electricity. And so that's available for import, and there's even some emergency volumes available when Ukraine really needs it. And Ukraine isn't using all of this capacity at the same time. You know, sometimes it's actually exporting a decent amount as well. But it's important to know that trade is working really nicely, but that it is still a bit more limited due to some technical constraints.
Now, going back to what you were saying about gas, because I think that's a really interesting illustration of how quickly things can change. Where are we with storage levels ahead of this winter compared to the last few winters that we see?
So going into this heating season, Ukraine had a total storage target of 13.2 billion cubic meters. And that is up from 12.8 in 2024. And that included both imports and domestic production. Ukraine estimated its import needs to be about 4.6 BCM to help meet winter demand, which we expect could reach roughly 12 BCM. And then the recent attacks that we've seen in the last 2 weeks have knocked out more production. The question is how quickly can that production come back online, which we don't know. But the number being floated right now of additional import needs is about 4.4 BCM. So they have to find even more gas to import to get through this heating season.
Now, I want to ask as well about energy storage, how much energy is being stored in batteries. But I'm just wondering how that picture has changed, because perhaps from a low base, but we're at a relatively high level now compared to where we were before 2022.
So batteries are playing an increasing role in Ukraine's energy resilience story. When we were on the ground in Ukraine, we had an opportunity to visit a battery storage facility. This was built by the company DTEC with the American company Fluence. And they built a complex of 6 battery systems that together have a capacity of 200 megawatts. They can store 400 megawatt hours, and that means that they can power 600,000 homes in Ukraine for 2 hours at a time. And this is a great example of how distributed energy resources can help strengthen the grid and provide backup power. And they were actually able to put this facility, these 6 facilities, in about 6 months in record time, and they are already being used by the system operator. It's really an amazing example of both technical innovation and Ukrainian companies working together with international partners.
Okay, now like last year, the IEA has a set of recommendations for this winter, but they're distinct because obviously the threat has changed. So let's pick out a few of them. It talks about boosting protection for critical infrastructure, but what are we talking about there? I just wonder if you can expand what sort of protection we're talking about.
So air defense is the best way to protect Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And you can also combine that with passive defense measures like adding sandbags to energy infrastructure, things like gabions, building concrete structures over certain pieces of equipment like transformers. And so that kind of layered approach to defense is really the best way to protect energy infrastructure, no matter what it is. But obviously, it's imperfect depending on how things are attacked.
And what about other things like anti-drone netting or even just people sending in spare parts to help either with damaged infrastructure or to help to protect the energy infrastructure as well?
I mean, the equipment needs are massive, both in terms of the spare parts for energy infrastructure and the equipment to protect energy infrastructure. So anti-drone netting is a great example. We're also talking about radar to help detect attacks. That's all part of this layered method of defense that really helps strengthen energy infrastructure. And the needs on the ground are huge. The equipment needs are really great, particularly for things like auto transformers for the power system. So it's just a question of being able to have enough strategic stocks of key pieces to be able to replace what keeps getting attacked.
Okay, and I also want to ask you about diversification of energy. And that's something that the IEA has spoken about a lot. But when it comes to Ukraine, is it right to see it in these relatively simple terms that if you have one big energy plant, that could be vulnerable to a small number of missiles, whereas if you have multiple, for example, wind farms or solar panels, that would require more missiles and potentially that could bring more energy security to more people?
100%. We know that decentralized energy infrastructure is so much more resilient to attacks. We're talking about batteries, solar PV, wind, mobile gas turbines, large-scale diesel generators. All of these different technologies work together to increase resilience. And it is so much harder, for example, to destroy a whole wind farm than it is to fully take out one centralized thermal power plant.
Okay, I also want to know what Ukraine's partners, what other countries can do. What has worked in the past over previous winters, and what is the best way for them to help this time around?
So Ukraine's partners have played a key role in helping Ukraine maintain energy security and resilience over the past few years. There are initiatives like the Energy Community's Energy Support Fund. There's the G7 Plus Energy Coordination Group. Those help coordinate equipment needs, deliveries, and sourcing. They also are a great way to channel funding from international partners to the energy companies, to the people on the ground who really, really need it from the energy perspective. But it's about doing more, making sure that the equipment needs are fulfilled as quickly as possible, that it's easier to import this equipment into the country, and for that equipment to actually be plugged into the system. So it's also about capacity building and not just funding.
Okay, lastly, I think it's worth us returning to the residents, the population in Ukraine. So how are they preparing for winter? And what are some of the things that could be happening in households across Ukraine?
So every winter, People know that it could be a really hard one. They think back to that first winter of the war that was incredibly hard. Some villages even had only, half an hour of electricity per day a few years ago. So they know the extremes already. At this point, pretty much every household has bought, I think, an EcoFlow backup battery. They have these backup power systems in, most households. They know that there are places in the community to go to have access to power and heating. Sometimes there's co-working spaces that have sprung up in cafes. People stock up on candles. People stock up on extra space heaters, batteries for your phone, batteries for your laptop. It's really about just those extra systems. Pretty much every shop and restaurant has a diesel generator. So people know what they have to buy and they're kind of ready for the winter. And it's also about trying to think about habits to reduce demand. And the Ukrainian government, the energy companies all communicate through messaging apps like Telegram, through social media to try and warn residents when they should be using electricity less during times when there's a lot of rolling blackouts. So it's about that kind of communication and planning to get through the winter, but it's still a challenging prospect. Each winter brings that level of stress where you don't know how bad the attacks are going to be.
Okay, well, Talya Vatman, thanks very much for coming to talk to us.
Thanks so much for having me.